Hi. Welcome to Curious Collections. Every town has its mysteries, right? Titusville actually has a cold case that dates back almost exactly 150 years. So in today's episode, we're going to take a look at the death on the Franklin Street Bridge. On January 28, 1871, at about 1 in the morning, refinery workers Barney O'Neill and Frederick Lang were on their way to their shift at the Morelands refinery. They noticed in the light of the moon there was someone laying on the bridge that they presumed to be a drunk, so they went over to give the man a shake. What they saw when they got closer sent them running for the police. The figure on the bridge, far from being drunk, had been stabbed to death. He was laying on his back with his arms outstretched, his head near the railway of the bridge and his legs extending out into the road. He had a stab wound in his abdomen, cuts on his face, and a fatal stab wound in the side of his neck. Blood was pooled in the snow on the ground near him, splashed on the rails of the bridge, and leading in a path northward along the east side of the bridge the whole way to the Buffalo House Hotel, which is near where McDonald's parking lot would be today. The man's pants pockets had been turned inside out and were empty, but in the pockets of his coat they found a pair of kid gloves, a handkerchief, and a life insurance policy. The name on the policy was James Wisner. James Sutton Wisner was 28 years old. Acquaintances described him as being of medium build, muscular, with a thin face, a prominent nose, and downturned mouth. He was formerly from Ithaca, New York, and had come to Titusville with his young daughter Ada in the late 1860s to live with his mother and brothers after the death of his wife. He had served with the Union Army during the Civil War, and for the past year he had been working as a clerk in Shank's grocery store on Diamond Street in town. He was said to be very temperate in his habits. He wasn't a drinker or a carouser, generally an upright citizen. The police did what they could, but forensics and fingerprinting were still roughly 20 years in the future, and the first Sherlock Holmes story wouldn't come out until 1887. There had been no eyewitnesses to the crime, no obvious motive, and clues were scarce. By sifting through testimony recorded in the Titusville Herald, though, we can get an idea of some of the facts of the case. Around 6:30 p.m. Friday evening, January 27th, James Wisner left his home, which was on the east side of Franklin Street, 3 doors down from the south end of the bridge. His brother said he had been ill for the previous 2 weeks, and this was only the second time he'd been out since coming down sick. The previous evening, he had ventured out to an Oddfellows Club meeting. At 8 o'clock p.m., he was seen at Christopher's Oyster House at 23 Diamond Street, where he had conversations with a number of people and drank a glass of cider. A former co-worker of his saw him there and stated that Wisner was very sober, and he left the restaurant alone at about 10:45 p.m. Wisner's body was found at 1 a.m. on Saturday morning, less than 30 yards away from his own front door. The black pocketbook that he normally carried with him was missing, but his brother James said that he seldom carried much cash on him in any case. His pants pockets had been turned inside out and were empty, but in the breast pocket of his coat was a life insurance policy in the amount of $8,000, with his daughter Ada listed as beneficiary. $8,000 adjusted for inflation would equate to roughly $71,000 today. At the time of his death, Wisner had been unemployed for about 6 weeks. He and another clerk at Shank's Grocery, a man by the name of Samuel Greening, had had an argument because Greening had been put in charge of the store even though he'd been hired after Wisner, and Wisner was incensed about it. Mr. Shank, the owner of the store, ended up firing both men. In an interview later, Shank stated that he'd followed up with Greening about the argument and that Wisner had actually come to the shop since being fired, but neither man had asked to be rehired. Wisner's body was taken to the engine house next door to City Hall, and the doctor was called in to do an examination. He stated that Wisner had been stabbed with a blade that was triangular in shape. The hole in his abdomen went in roughly 5 inches. There were superficial cuts on the right-hand side of his face, and there was a stab wound in the right side of his neck that had actually severed his jugular vein and reached to the base of his brain. The doctor also noted that Wisner's muscles were rather developed and it would have taken a stout man to handle him. Men sent out to search the area where Wisner was found turned up an object in the middle of Oil Creek, about 15 feet from the edge of the bridge. It was half of a pair of German-made shears imprinted with a clover leaf that had been ground down until the point was as sharp as a needle. The shear blade fit exactly in the wounds on Wisner's body. Theories and rumors took off in the days following Wisner's death, partially egged on by the fact that the town had decided to offer a $1,000 reward for information leading to the conviction of the murderer. This later swelled to $3,000 after a group of concerned prominent citizens decided to take up a collection to increase the expand the award in the hopes that the larger amount would draw prominent detectives to the area. When you consider that the average unskilled laborer in Titusville made roughly $8 per week in 1871, a $3,000 reward would have been the equivalent of 7 years' salary. Would-be tipsters flooded the police department with suggestions. While many theories were incredibly far-fetched and based almost entirely on circumstantial evidence, the following theories were actually followed up on by law enforcement. A Titusville man by the name of Lang said that around 8 p.m. on the evening of the murder, he was standing at the corner of Spring and Franklin Streets when he was approached by a rather dapper-dressed man who asked him where Shank's grocery store was and whether or not a man named Wisner was there. Lang pointed out the grocery shop, and the man said that he was a close friend of Wisner's and had come the whole way from Chicago to see him. Lang also said that the man had a mustache, chin whiskers, and wore a plug hat, something between a bowler and a top hat with a short, stiff brim. The mention of Chicago caught law enforcement's attention because Wisner's wife's family was actually in possession of some real estate holdings in Chicago that were currently in the process of being bought out to the tune of around $50,000. Close to $1 million today, adjusted for inflation, and Wisner's daughter Ada would have been next in line for the money. Obviously, as she was only 5 years old at the time of his death, however, it's likely that her father would have managed her estate until she came to adulthood. The description of the man from Chicago led to a number of citizens' arrests, and the Herald posted an article warning men in town with facial hair to beware, since it was likely that they would end up in a cell for the crime of resembling a suspected murderer. One man by the name of James Marshall was actually arrested and held for 3 days after a theory sprang up regarding a diamond ring. The story's a bit tangled, but it goes something like this. A gentleman named Brown in town supposedly loaned a diamond ring to a woman by the name of Carrie Lee, who was a former girlfriend of James Marshall. Lee then said that the diamond ring had been stolen by a woman by the name of Joe Morgan, who ran a brothel in town. Joe Morgan was actually taken to court and acquitted of the crime, but committed suicide shortly after, roughly around the time of Wisner's death. The theory sprang up that Carrie Lee and the murdered man Wisner were intimate, and that she had given the diamond ring to Wisner for safekeeping, whereupon Marshall murdered him to get it. As it happens, James Marshall was in Corey at the time the murder took place, and when Carrie Lee was questioned, she stated that she had never seen Wisner before the police had showed up with his photograph. Both of their alibis stood up and the theory was abandoned, but not before James Marshall wrote an absolutely scathing letter to the newspaper protesting his warrantless arrest. A less complicated theory than the diamond ring scenario revolves around a man named John Knox. Knox was relatively new to Titusville and had worked as a printer for both the Titusville Herald office and a competing newspaper, the Courier. Tipsters said that Knox had been at Christopher's Oyster House the evening of the murder and that he and Wisner had had a heated argument. What was said during the argument was not recorded. However, it was noted that Wisner had served in the Union Army during the Civil War in both the 32nd New York Infantry and the 3rd New York Artillery, while Knox had been a member of a rebel cavalry company out of Memphis, Tennessee. Knox abruptly left town a few days after Wisner's death, and 4 months later it was noted in the paper that he had committed suicide in a hospital in Hartford, Connecticut. In memorializing Knox, the Herald said that he was a kind-hearted and generous man, but of intemperate habits. Now that poor Knox is dead, they wrote, possibly someone may charge him with having been the murderer of Wisner, but nobody but a lunatic or a fool would be guilty of such an accusation. The final theory we'll cover today, and the only one that actually led to a trial, concerns a tailor by the name of Charles Gross. Gross was a German and plied his trade in Pleasantville in the days leading up to the murder. Witnesses stated that they had come across Gross in Titusville that Friday afternoon. He was highly agitated, saying that his wife had thrown him out and he was after someone and going to kill him. When he was asked to elaborate, Gross said that his wife had been seen multiple times with a man who had come from Titusville with a wagon and that she could go to hell now for support. Other witnesses were recorded saying that they'd seen a Shank's grocery delivery cart at the Gross residence in Pleasantville and that the man driving had gone round to the back of the house and gone in. Coupled with this information, the fact that the murder weapon was a German-made pair of shears and that Gross, the German tailor, left town for New York shortly after or around the time of the murder, it apparently added up to enough that authorities arrested Charles Gross on suspicion of murder and held him for court at the end of August 1871. Unfortunately, the prosecution's case soon fell apart when they realized that another man from Titusville had actually accompanied Gross on his train trip to New York, and that they had the tickets showing that at the time of the murder they had been held over in Corey. It also came to the jury's attention that it could not be conclusively stated that James Wisner had been driving the Shank's delivery cart that was seen at the Gross's home in Pleasantville. Ultimately, Charles Gross was acquitted, and the case of who murdered James Wisner remains unsolved. Given these facts, do you think you could have discovered what happened to James Wisner? If you have a theory, feel free to drop it in the comments box below. And if you enjoyed this episode, stop by the library and check out our true crime section. In the meantime, stay well, stay healthy, and we'll see you in the stacks. Bye now.